On January 28, 1945, 27 German women stopped speaking at the exact same time. Not because a guard had shouted, not because a rifle had been raised. Because a United States Army sergeant had just rolled a steel cart into the prisoner mess hall, and the cart was covered with glass bottles of Coca-Cola. Anneliese Kraus sat at the end of the second table with both hands folded around a tin spoon. She was 32 years old, a former Luftwaffe communications clerk, and she had learned to hide fear so well that even her face obeyed orders. But when she saw those bottles, dark brown liquid sealed under bright metal caps, her throat tightened. Beside her, Martha Weiss leaned close and whispered in German, "What are they giving us?" Nobody answered. The bottles looked too deliberate, too clean, too evenly counted. In Germany, when women in uniform were lined up and given identical glass containers, it was never for pleasure. It was medicine, sedative, inoculation. Some new wartime necessity explained by a man who never had to drink it first. Sergeant Roy Whittaker parked the cart near the stove. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced from the cold, and careful in a way that made the women more suspicious, not less. He lifted one bottle, hooked the cap under the opener, and pulled. Half the room flinched. One woman dropped her spoon. The sergeant blinked, then looked at Lieutenant Mary Caldwell, who stood near the door in her wool overcoat, watching the whole room tense around a drink. Whittaker forced a small smile. "It's Coca-Cola," he said slowly. "Soda pop, for drinking." Anneliese understood maybe 3 words: Coca-Cola, drinking, and something in his tone that sounded almost impossible, ordinary. Ilse Hartmann, who had once worked in a military pharmacy outside Cologne, stared at the fizz crawling up the glass neck. She said in careful English, "For sickness?" Whittaker shook his head. "No, ma'am." The word ma'am moved through the room like a second sound, quieter than the bottle opening, stranger than the fizz. "No, ma'am." He said it to a prisoner. He said it to a German. Lieutenant Caldwell stepped forward before the silence hardened into panic. Her German was rough, but better than most of the guards. "Not medicine," she said. "Not punishment. Just a drink." Then she looked at all 27 of them and added, "Because today is Sunday." That confused them more than the bottles. Because Sunday, in the Germany Anneliese had left behind, no longer meant rest. It meant the same thin soup, the same sirens, the same paper promises pasted over the same empty shelves. But here, in a snowbound American prison camp in northern Wisconsin, Sunday apparently meant the enemy could hand you sugar in a glass bottle and expect nothing back. To understand why that bottle frightened them, you have to understand what they had been told would happen when they reached America. They had arrived at Camp Halstead 25 days earlier, on January 3, under a sky the color of dirty wool. The transport truck came through 2 gates and stopped beside a row of low wooden barracks left over from a civilian conservation corps camp. Barbed wire ran along the perimeter. A guard tower stood at the corner. Beyond it were frozen pine trees and fields buried under snow. Anneliese climbed down last. She still wore a gray skirt uniform with the insignia removed, and a coat that had belonged to someone broader. Her boots were stiff with salt from the Atlantic crossing. In one hand she carried a cloth bag containing 2 pairs of stockings, a broken comb, a photograph of her mother, and a folded letter she had read so many times the paper felt like fabric. The women had been captured weeks earlier during the German collapse in Belgium. Most had been clerks, radio assistants, hospital orderlies, drivers. They had not fired rifles. They had not commanded men. But they had worn the uniform, and by 1945 the uniform felt heavier than armor. All the way across the ocean, and they had traded rumors in whispers. American camps were brutal. American soldiers hated German women. American food was poisoned. American interrogators smiled before they broke you. The rumors did not need evidence. They fit inside the world they had been given. So when Lieutenant Caldwell met them at the gate with a clipboard instead of a whip, nobody trusted the clipboard. She was not large. She was not theatrical. She had dark hair pinned under her cap and tired eyes that looked as if they had slept very little since the war began. Through an interpreter, she read the camp rules. You will be housed in Barrack 9. You will receive meals, medical care, winter clothing, and male privileges when available. You will work only under approved labor assignments. You will obey the guards. The guards will obey regulations. Then she looked up from the clipboard. Any man who mistreats you answers to me first. The interpreter repeated it in German. That was the first sentence that made the women look at her. Not because they believed her. Because nobody had expected protection to be part of imprisonment. Barrack 9 smelled of fresh pine boards, coal smoke, and wool blankets. There were iron cots in 2 rows, a black stove in the center, wash basins near the door, and a shelf where each woman could keep her few belongings. It was bare, it was cold, it was a prison, but it was clean. Marta ran her fingers over a folded blanket and frowned as though she had discovered evidence of a trap. They give prisoners blankets this thick, she whispered. They want us soft, Ilse said. Then they question us. But that night no one came to question them. The guards locked the door from outside. The stove kept burning. Snow tapped against the windows. 27 women lay awake in American cots, waiting for cruelty that did not arrive. The cruelty kept failing to arrive. That was the first crack. The next morning, a corporal named Ruth Bell came in carrying a metal coffee urn and a stack of tin cups. "Good morning," she said. Her German stretched the words into something clumsy. "Guten Morgen." A few women stared at her as if clumsiness itself might be a trick. She walked from cot to cot and poured hot coffee for each prisoner. The coffee was weak by American standards, but to women who had spent years drinking roasted barley and calling it coffee, it felt almost indecent. At breakfast there was oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, canned peaches, and another pot of coffee. Not a feast, not a banquet, just breakfast. That was worse. A feast could be explained as a performance. Breakfast could not. Greta Loos, the youngest at 19, touched the butter with the edge of her knife and whispered, "Is this real?" Anneliese said nothing. She was doing arithmetic. 27 prisoners. 2 slices of toast each. Butter thick enough to see. Peaches in January. Coffee twice before sunrise. If America could feed enemy prisoners like this, then what had Germany been fighting? Not the America from the speeches. Not the starving, chaotic country from the newsreels. Something larger. something with full storehouses and quiet confidence, something that did not need to hate them in order to beat them. That idea was too dangerous to say out loud. So they spoke of smaller things, the soap in the washroom, the extra socks, the way Private Samuel Ortiz tipped his cap before entering the barrack, as if a room full of prisoners still deserved warning. The way Corporal Bell noticed that Marta's cough worsened at night and brought her closer to the stove. The way Sergeant Whitaker remembered that Ilse could not eat pork and quietly found her beans instead. None of it made sense if the Americans were beasts. None of it made sense if German victory had ever been inevitable. And then came the Coca-Cola. Lieutenant Caldwell did not order the women to drink. That made the thing stranger. Whitaker moved from table to table, setting down one bottle for each prisoner. Condensation formed on the glass, even in the cold room. The red labels looked impossibly cheerful against the gray wool sleeves and scarred wooden tables. When he reached Anneliese, he placed the bottle in front of her as carefully as if it were a cup of tea. "There you go," he said. She did not touch it. Across the table, Greta leaned closer until her breath fogged the glass. "It bubbles by itself." Ilse narrowed her eyes. "Carbonated. There is gas inside." Marta gave a humorless laugh. "Yes, Ilse, we can see that." Whitaker opened his own bottle and drank first. He tipped it back, swallowed, and sighed like a man relieved by something ordinary. Not dead, not sick, not acting, just drinking. The women watched him the way people watch a bridge before stepping onto it. Finally, Anneliese picked up her bottle. It was colder than she expected, heavy, solid. A small thing made with more glass than German shops had seen in years. She raised it to her mouth. The first sip shocked her. The fizz struck her tongue, sharp and alive. The sweetness came next, so strong it almost hurt. Beneath it was a taste she could not name, dark and herbal, like a secret recipe from a country too rich to keep secrets. She swallowed too quickly and coughed. Greta covered her mouth, terrified for half a second. Then Anneliese laughed. It was not a graceful laugh. It broke out of her before she could stop it. A small, startled sound that made her look younger than she had looked in years. "It's not medicine," she said in German. Then, because the bubbles were still prickling in her throat, she added, "Unless Americans treat sadness with sugar." That was the first time the room laughed together. Not loudly, not freely, but enough. Greta took a sip and gasped. Marta drank and then stared into the bottle as though a government secret might be printed at the bottom. Ilse insisted they should not drink too fast because the caffeine content was strategically relevant, which only made the others laugh again. Whitaker did not understand the words, but he understood the sound. He leaned on the cart, smiling at the floor, letting the enemy remember how to be young. After that Sunday, the bottles became a kind of measure, not of kindness alone, of scale. The women began noticing what America wasted without thinking. Sugar packets left half-used, orange peels thrown away, white bread served daily, newspapers so thick they seemed like bundles of cloth. In Germany, a single egg could reorganize a household. A piece of chocolate could make a child silent with awe. Coffee was a memory people brewed from burned grain and imagination. At Camp Halstead, the kitchen burned through real coffee by the gallon. Anneliese tried to explain this to herself as propaganda, a show. a carefully staged illusion designed to break them. But illusions usually had edges. This abundance did not. It came in supply trucks, in mail sacks, in crates of soap, in extra pencils for English lessons, in magazines left lying around because no one thought paper itself was precious. One afternoon, Private Ortiz brought in a stack of old Saturday Evening Post issues for the recreation shelf. Greta opened one and stared at an advertisement showing a smiling family beside a refrigerator. "A refrigerator in the house," she said. Marta took the magazine from her. "That is for rich people." "No," Greta said, pointing to the text she could barely read. "It says installment plan." The phrase meant nothing to her, so Corporal Bell explained. Ordinary families could buy one and pay over time. Ordinary families. The words worked like a splinter, because the lie they had been raised inside did not collapse all at once. It split under small pressures. Butter, coffee, soap. A soldier saying, "Ma'am." A bottle of Coca-Cola handed to a prisoner because it was Sunday. Every small thing asked the same question. What else had been false? At night, the women argued in whispers. Marta held longest to suspicion. She had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front and could not bear the thought that they had died inside a story someone else had written. "They are kind because they are winning," she said. "That is easy." Ilse answered from her cot. "Germany was cruel when it was winning." Nobody spoke after that. The worst revelations came in April. Not from a soda bottle, not from a guard, from photographs. Dr. Howard Bell, the camp physician, asked Lieutenant Caldwell for permission to bring newspapers into the barrack common room. By then, the spring thaw had turned the yard to black mud, and the war in Europe sounded close to ending even from the other side of the ocean. The women had heard rumors for weeks. Cities falling. The Rhine crossed. American forces inside Germany. But rumors still belonged to war. Photographs were different. Dr. Bell placed the newspapers on the table and removed his glasses. "I do not believe most of you knew," he said, while Ilse translated. "But you should not learn this from rumor." The pictures were grainy. That did not soften them. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors behind wire, not prisoners, as Anneliese understood prisoners, but human beings reduced to bone and eyes. Barracks, pits, crematorium doors, names printed under the images. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, German names, German places, German crimes. Marta grabbed one paper and shook her head before she had fully seen it. "No, no, this is Allied fabrication." Her voice was fierce. Then it broke, because Ilse, the pharmacy clerk, had gone white. She bent over one photograph, studying the shape of a body with the terrible discipline of someone trained to look at evidence. "That is starvation," she whispered. "Not one day, not 1 week." She touched the newspaper with 2 fingers and pulled her hand back as if it had burned her. Greta began crying without sound. Anneliese could not cry. Something colder than grief moved through her. She remembered the oaths, the salutes, the posters, the speeches about enemies of the Reich, the comfortable phrase everyone used when trains passed and questions became dangerous. "We do not know." Now she knew, and knowledge did not make her innocent. It made the old innocence impossible. For 3 days, the women barely ate. The mess hall stayed quiet. The Coca-Cola crate sat untouched near the kitchen wall. Whitaker stopped rolling them out because even he understood that sweetness could not meet that kind of shame directly. On the fourth day, Lieutenant Caldwell entered Barrack 9 alone. No speech, no clipboard. She carried a wooden crate with 6 bottles inside. She placed it on the common table and said, in her broken German, "You do not have to drink." Then she sat. That was all. For almost an hour, nobody moved. Finally, Marta stood, took 1 bottle, and opened it herself. The sound filled the room. She did not drink immediately. She held the bottle in both hands and said, "My brother died saying the Americans were animals." Her face twisted. He was wrong. No one corrected her. No one comforted her too quickly. Anneliese reached for a bottle next. The drink tasted different after the photographs. Not sweeter, heavier. As if the same bubbles now carried every question she had avoided. But in the weeks that followed, the afternoon bottles returned. Not as celebration, as ritual. At 3 o'clock, Whitaker would wheel the cart into the yard if the weather was clear. The women would sit on overturned crates near the barrack wall, drinking slowly while snowmelt ran under the fence, and the guards tried not to look as interested in the conversation as they were. Sometimes Whitaker talked about Texas. He described heat so powerful it made roads shimmer, a mother who fried chicken every Sunday, and a nephew who collected bottle caps in a cigar box. Sometimes Ortiz played harmonica. Sometimes Corporal Bell brought knitting and taught Greta how to fix a dropped stitch without swearing in 2 languages. Mrs. Nora Whitcomb came on Sundays from a Lutheran church in town. Her own son had been killed near St. Lo, and the first time she walked into Barrack 9, every German woman lowered her eyes. They expected hatred. She brought cinnamon rolls wrapped in cloth. "I am not here because grief made me noble," she told them through Ilse. "I am here because grief made hatred too heavy to carry." Anneliese never forgot that sentence. She repeated it years later in English, but it never sounded as sharp as it had sounded through Ilse's trembling voice. Hatred too heavy to carry. On May 8, 1945, the camp radio announced Germany's surrender. In American towns, bells rang. People shouted in streets. Cars honked. Men kissed women they did not know. At Camp Halstead, the celebration sounded far away. For the women in Barrack 9, victory did not belong to them. Defeat did not fully describe them either. Something else had ended. A country, a certainty, a version of themselves. That evening, Lieutenant Caldwell gathered them in the mess hall and explained what would happen next. Processing, repatriation, displaced persons camps in Europe, letters through the Red Cross, transportation when available. Home. The word should have opened a door. Instead, it opened a pit. Marta had no word from Dresden. Ilse's parents had died in Cologne. Greta's hometown lay in the Soviet zone, and every refugee letter made return sound less like rescue than another kind of danger. Anneliese had one Red Cross message from her mother, months old, saying their apartment in Bremen no longer existed, and that her younger sister had not been found after an air raid. Home was no longer a place waiting with lamps in the windows. Home was rubble with a familiar name. That night, the women sat behind Barrack 9 with the last crate Whitaker had saved for them. The June air smelled of wet pine and coal smoke. Mosquitoes hovered near the fence. Somewhere beyond the camp, an American baseball game crackled on a radio. Greta held her bottle without drinking. "If I do not want to go back," she said, "does that make me a traitor?" No one answered quickly. Then Anneliese said, "We already betrayed something." Greta looked at her. Anneliese turned the bottle in her hands, watching the last line of light move through the glass. "We betrayed the truth. We did it by believing what was easier to believe. Going back will not fix that. Staying will not erase it." She looked toward the mess hall, where Lieutenant Caldwell was checking forms under a bare light bulb. "But now we know the difference between obedience and dignity. We have to live somewhere with that knowledge." 11 of the 27 women eventually petitioned not to be sent directly back to Germany. It was not simple. Nothing after the war was simple. Some were transferred first through displaced persons channels. Some found sponsors. Some were refused and tried again. Some returned to Europe and later emigrated legally, carrying American addresses folded into their papers like hidden keys. Marta went back. She said someone had to search the ruins. Il stayed and trained as a nurse. Greta stayed and became a school aide for immigrant children because she understood what it meant to be young inside a language that could not hold your grief. Anneliese stayed last. Mrs. Whitcomb sponsored her in Milwaukee, where she first cleaned offices, then translated letters for German families trying to locate missing relatives. Years later, she married a machinist whose brother had died in the Ardennes. He told her on their second walk that part of him hated Germans. Anneliese said, "Part of me does too." That was the beginning of honesty. 20 years after the winter at Camp Halstead, Anneliese stood in a small kitchen in Milwaukee while her son twisted the cap off a Coca-Cola bottle against the opener mounted beside the icebox. He drank without thinking. No fear, no suspicion, no calculation of sugar, glass, freight, armies, lies. Just a boy in an American kitchen, thirsty after school. Anneliese watched the bubbles rise and felt the old room return. The wooden tables, the gray sleeves, the sergeant pretending not to notice their terror. The first hiss that made 27 prisoners flinch. Her daughter asked why she always went quiet when someone opened a bottle. Anneliese took the bottle from her son, held it up to the afternoon light, and saw her own reflection bent in the dark glass. "Because once," she said, "I thought this was medicine." Her children laughed. She smiled with them. But after they ran outside, she stood alone by the sink for a moment, listening to the soft fizz fade. The bottle had not forgiven her. America had not washed the past clean with sugar. Nothing so simple had happened. But that first Coca-Cola had done something no speech, no interrogation, no victory parade could do. It had made the enemy ordinary. It had made kindness undeniable. And it had forced a woman raised on lies to ask why the people called monsters were the first people in years to treat her like a human being. The drink was gone in minutes. The lie took years to empty.